Drums of War, Chapter 47, Part 1, to Xur. In the upper atmosphere over the Exarch homeworld, the planet rapidly approached Major General Eric George's drop pod had a name. General George didn't care. He keyed his comms to listen in on his division and heard various officers and NCOs giving last-second pep talks, invocations of good men's names, good men who now or will soon lay quiet in repose. The general had one son there, and another headstone waiting for whatever remains could be recovered for another. His wife had refused to bury an empty casket, and he didn't blame her. There was also the good amount of swearing and insults, and a decent amount of NCO snapping privates out of nerves. Good. It was a sign that the men were confident, but not overconfident. He glanced at the readout that showed the telemetry from the hundreds of drop pods carrying his division towards the ground. It showed that they were all within the margin of error. General George nodded with satisfaction before focusing on another screen that displayed a zoomed-in feed of the landing zone. Well, technically, it was only showing the LZ because he was on target. He'd have to send his compliments to the crew of the Robin Williams for how well they'd done to get him on that trajectory. He made a decision and aimed for a relatively open area about 3 clicks down a wide road from the target's front gates. The Lost Boys weren't there to be subtle. This decision altered the planned deployment of his brigadier generals and colonels, but they would have plenty of time to adjust. The ground hurtled closer. Each drop pod's rattled as it deployed chaff and ablative material shed away, taking the heat of friction from the entry with it. Even fellow Terran enemies hadn't managed to knock a drop pod out of the sky before, but that didn't mean that it was impossible. It was part of the reason an operative CO always led the way. That way, the men knew that they were following the orders of a man who, like them, had placed his mortal body on the line for his republic and her civilians. The ground hurtled closer. The road was something similar to concrete, it appeared, and it looked like it had been built to handle heavy traffic. Traffic that was non-existent. General George did not waste time wondering what the place used to be before Xur went mad and enslaved the Exarch. Instead, he noticed some defensive positions on either side of and on top of the gate, as well as potential positions along the road. Intel said that the enemy had been concentrating forces in anticipation of an invasion. Xur knew that it was losing, it seemed. General George's drop pod jerked, and he slammed against the nylon safety strapping inside his armor as it began to slow its descent to a velocity his pod could compensate for on impact. The ground hurtled closer, slightly less quickly. General George's bones suddenly felt creaky. Old wounds ached under the scars, and the pain of his grief swelled in his heart. Hadn't he already given the Republic enough? Didn't he already do his own father proud? Would it be so bad for him to step back and let younger men, stronger men, lead and retire? The ground hurtled yet closer, and General George could pick out individual offenders on the palace ramparts. 2 sons and decades of faithful service, and his 3 remaining sons served still. Anyone would say that he'd earned his rest. Anyone would agree that he'd given plenty. Anyone except himself. Concrete shattered as the drop pod impacted and sent a spray of shrapnel flying in a ring around the shallow crater it had created, and the explosive charges blew the hatch off the pod and cut the safety straps restraining his power armor. Eric George strode into battle, fairly roaring the names of his son, Roger and Robbie, and his adopted nephew, Yovdril, and for the murder of this among the star-tides we sing, and of over 70 names he knew from "It's my solemn duty to inform you" letters. He roared in fury and grief and rage and pain as he shouldered his weapon and began killing. The whistle-crack boom of his staff pods impacting nearby drowned him out, however. His own pod's entrenchment systems whirred to life as 4 thick metal crab-like legs reoriented it from its point of impact. The protective housing crowding the pod was shattered by tiny explosive charges, and a 4-barrel autocannon turret was revealed. General George tagged targets for it in his HUD, and it came to life with the base whomp-whomp-whomp of its magnetic accelerators, sending tungsten-wrapped iron balls slamming through enemy cover, through enemies, and through more enemy cover. The Lost Boys weren't here to be subtle, and they weren't here to prepare the way for the army. They were there as the tip of the spear and fully intended to be driven into the very heart of the enemy. To that end, it was time to establish the Divisional Forward Command Center. Meanwhile, Captain John George swallowed his nerves as in his drop pod. Sure, he'd been a captain for over 3 months now, but this would be the first time he'd led the company in tactical operations. Due to the nature of the Lost Boys' operational ethos, he'd been pulling double duty, leading a platoon on those drops, mentoring a second lieutenant. The poor guy had gotten his bars in the field in an irregular R&I battalion, and did too good a job, so command wanted him to get a prime education. On the other hand, he'd been a part of the brigade deployment and 3 company-level deployments, so he had a general idea of how this sort of thing would go along with what the book said to do. There was only a minor reason to be nervous. He was taking the field with the old man. Of course, nobody called his father that in front of him, but the general's grey hair were a comfort to the men. The old man knew his shit. He'd been around the block, circled it again, decided it was too small, and made a new block to go around when it came to on-the-ground tactics. The young man had a lot to live up to in his man's eyes, since he was the old man's son, and, on the other hand, he was terrified of disappointing his father. However, nothing is worse for morale than a nervous CO, so he did his best to swallow his nerves. A deep breath, hold, and let out slowly. Then he looked at the readout displaying the progress of the drop. The Divisional Commander Center lit up green as it went online. 10 seconds later, 3 more little circles lit up green, equidistant to each other, as the brigade command centers went online as well. And he briefly considered cycling through the camera feeds of each to get a better idea of the conditions on the ground. He realized he didn't have enough time for a good look at each, so he just keyed his display to bring up the command center for a 2nd Brigade. Unfortunately, the enemy did not politely surrender once the Lost Boys' upper level of command went boots down and started putting holes in their defenses. No, they very rudely decided to fight back instead. More fooled them, since the enemy only existed to be destroyed if they knew they'd quit being the enemy. Another glance at the drop progress readout showed the battalion-level command centers coming online. He cycled through the camera feeds of those positions, and even took a peek at his battalion commander's helmet feed. The enemy was bringing up mechanized weapon platforms. He didn't have much time, so he keyed his comms to only include himself and the 2nd lieutenant he'd been mentoring. The confused mix of profanity and banter he'd been listening to became silent. Just like he thought, the kid was in his own head. "Takeda," he snapped. Aye, sir? You weren't listening to your platoon bullshit on the way down." Captain George tried to keep accusation out of his voice. The kid didn't do well with accusations. "It seemed private, sir." "You're a lieutenant and out from under my wing, and I can't be looking over your shoulder when I've got a whole company to worry about. It's your job to gauge whether your men's morale on the way down." "Aye, sir. When I key in now," 2nd Lieutenant Hikaru Takeda nervously stammered. Captain George sighed and told him, "Too late now. You know our part in the plan." "Aye, sir. We hit dirt and start taking down heavy weapons emplacements." "Good. What do you do if you're unsure of what to do?" "Ask my platoon sergeant, sir. He's been in the R&I longer than me, and he's seen more drops than me, and he's used to officers asking questions." "Good man. I'm about to go boots down. And remember, like you trust me,
The platoon trusts me."
Captain George keyed his mic back to listen in on the company as a whole and prepared for impact. Meanwhile, Sergeant Linus George listened in on his squad. By now, everyone knew he didn't like to talk much in the tube, or on the way down. But since he'd been promoted, he couldn't really afford to use it as a time to meditate before battle anymore. Hence the listening. Corporal Jack Stormborn and his team were talking about home and bitching about dropping on a desert world. Sergeant George grinned at that. He supposed if he was adapted to swimming in the absence of any major bodies of water would bother him too. He thought about shuffling those 5 around in the squad to avoid having such a specialized team, but they worked well together, and overstrength by one wasn't a terrible thing. Very well, in fact, so he left them the way they were. Corporal David Johnson was leading an old infantryman's debate, breasts or bottoms. The debate was quite spirited, but Sergeant George took a mental note to remember that specific combination of profanity. He did have to resist the urge to join in on that old unsettled question, even though his opinion was obviously correct. Corporal Joseph Scott was refereeing the team's ribbing of the new guy, Private Evan Larson, who was all bluster and bravado about his first drop. Sergeant George could hear the wide-eyed fear behind the bluster. But the new guy was trying to deal with that. His team was helping. The private wasn't likely to freeze if he was combating his fear with pure ignorant bravado beforehand. Well, maybe not purely ignorant, since R&I training does its best to prepare troopers for their first drop. On the other hand, a first drop was a first drop. However, Corporal Andrew Lewis's team, the Green Trooper's voice was notably absent in the debate of whether the latest book of fantasy series completely fucked the setting or not. It wasn't a very popular series, and seems to be in the category of so bad it's good, which is pretty rare for novels. However, the questionable literacy tastes of the squad were not important right now. Right now, the important thing was to do what he could to prevent a frozen trooper, or worse, a panicked one. "Ruiz," Sergeant George said after keying in to speak on the team channel. "Nervous?"
Yeah, aye, sir,"
Private Alvaro Ruiz said. It sounded like he was struggling not to choke on the words. "Me too."
You're a George, though, sir."
Sergeant George had to stop himself from laughing at the open awe in the young man's voice. It was still surprising how many people thought he was larger than life on account of his grandfather and of all things. "I'm still as mortal as you are, man. Every drop is scary, but once we're boots down, we'll be able to return fire, and it'll make you feel better."
Thank you, sir. I'll do my best, sir."
"That's all any one of us can do," Sergeant George answered. He suddenly found himself wishing that he could have run a few training drops with the Green Troopers. But wish and want as a man, well, that won't change the facts. Meanwhile, General George was in his fully activated command center. The drop pod he had ridden down on had become significantly lighter, and joined the other 4 pods in his staff to form a defensive ring for the position. Additionally, armored panels had been taken from the pods to erect a low wall between each of the 5 points of the defensive ring to give its occupants some cover to fire from. However, its main defense was the linked battle screen generators effectively stopping enemy plasma fire a good 2 yards away from the wall. That, or the 5 4-barreled autocannons set to obliterate anything that approached. Of course, this had the potential for tragic collateral damage, but the general had a reasonable hope that the fire and fury of his arrival had done a decent job of convincing any non-combatants that the area was extremely hazardous. His comms guy, Captain Tate Ironclad, had his gauntlets open as he could use his bare fingers to make fine adjustments to the delicate components inside the secure comms array, and was saying, "Battalion-level command centers are online, sir, but the Navy never got around to fixing this fault. Everyone's going to have to do this bypass on their relays, or we'll have to rely on ArmorNet for comms." "Get the word out, then," General George ordered, and looked at his ops guy, Major Miloslav Jurasek. Resistance is heavy at all strong points. Enemies bringing up mechanized weapon platforms, and more power-armored troops have been sighted, Major Jurasek informed him, as the two worked to set up command equipment. In his case, an array of screens to display various camera feeds and active maps. "I want the captains and their staff sergeants ready to flank and deal with any tank or anti-material mechanized equipment equivalents when their boots down," the general ordered, before giving his intel an inquiring look. Captain Takahashi Sato was gesturing with both of his hands, indicating that he was working on going through files on his HUD, like the intel reports from the DRS troopers scattered around the area. "Enemies mobilizing to attempt to counterattack from the planetary south, sir. DRS is disrupting command, and this is slowing them down, but the enemy's putting pressure on them. Tell them to bug out and get to our lines if enemy gets any such missions organized. The rest of the division should be boots down and dug in by then." "Aye, sir," Captain Sato snapped. "Captains are boots down," General George's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Sigrid von Guter, informed him. "Flanking of enemy mobile heavy weapons underway. Objective can be considered encircled." "Excellent. I want tactical objectives for the platoon elements ready the second they go boots down," General George snapped. "Aye, sir." Major Jurasek responded and started gesturing above the map screen, which indicated his helmet's HUD was simulating the holographic interface. "Takeshi, I need the pillbox reports." If General George didn't know his people as well as he did, he might have missed the flick of the wrist Captain Sato made in the midst of his work as he said, "DRS got fairly comprehensive data on the rampart system. Also, I give you the trench and tunnel map with what you desired." "Commo up," Captain Ironclad crowed, and screen showed flickering video feeds sharpened, and the map blinked to life with its various icons to represent command centers, company commanders, and platoon movements. Currently, they showed the latest only as circular LZ indicators with countdowns 27 seconds, 26, 25, and so on. General George narrowed his eyes at the map and said, "What are we doing about getting enemy placement and movements onto our attack maps?" "Combo now good," Captain Satter said. "Now getting drone net ready for going up. I'm thinking that we send drones up when platoons and boots down so that maybe the enemy will not be looking up." General George nodded again and started highlighting 24 points on the enemy ramparts. "These look like anti-orbital cannons. Unfortunately for the enemy, jock skippers are all too fast for them to have gotten a bead on any of them. They were in and out before the Exarch could realize they were under attack. Good for us. However, we have achieved surprise and have momentum. If their commander is smart, he'll man those points and turn them into massive direct line heavy weapons emplacements. If he's really smart, he'll man them and be ready to take a bite out of our reinforcements. Let's deny him the opportunity." "Aye, sir," Captain Sato said and tossed a file at the map, which caused it to highlight a few hundred buildings along the ramparts. "They are defended. A path cut here." He dragged his finger from the western edge of their perimeter across a dozen of the boxy buildings, and then along a zigzagging path to the first of the anti-orbital weapons, and perhaps from there finding a more direct path to the outer cannons. "Guta," the general said. "On it, sir." "We need to have some fortifications for our reinforcements to occupy," Major Jurasek said slowly. Meanwhile, Sergeant George's drop pod crashed into the brittle surface of one of the many roadways around the palace the entire Lost Boys division was assailing. The hatch went flying away from his pod and threw an Exarch warrior as he stepped out to cut down another half-dozen enemy warriors in short, efficient bursts of his automatic rifle. "Alpha leader boots down, checking comms," Sergeant George said, as gouts of hot plasma splashed against his armor's battle screen. "Commo good," his lieutenant responded. "We're on the breaching team. Get your demo guys ready to move up." "Aye, sir," Sergeant George said, as a whistle-crack boom of the squad's drop pods impacting filled the air. Then the checks from the corporals started coming in. "Red leader boots down, checking in. Team is boots down and active," Corporal Johnson growled. All the levity from the earlier debate was notably absent. "Blue leader," Corporal Lewis snapped out with parade ground Christmas. "Boots down, checking in. Team's boots down and active." "Green leader, boots down and checking in. Team is boots down and hot," Corporal Scott said, a little loudly. He was new to being a team leader. Hot was condition normal for the Lost Boy drop, but the book said that you tell your squad leader if you're under fire. "Gold leader, boots fucking down and checking the fuck in, even though his fucking sand trap has no water," Corporal Stormborn nearly shouted. He'd probably forgotten that his comms mic wouldn't pick up the weapon's fire again. "Alpha squad is boots down and green," Sergeant George reported, as he turned towards the looming sheer ramparts he'd be responsible for piercing. "Gold leader, pull the stick out of your ass and get your team ready for demo. You're on pillbox duty. Red and blue teams will be providing covering fire, and green team will watch our backs." "Sarge," Corporal Stormborn asked. "I need a workout," Sergeant George said casually, "and you might need someone taller than 4 feet high on your team. Are you sure there isn't a nice river or maybe a sewer that you could use for our approach?" Nope. You'll have to make do with moving across the ground like normal people. Normal people have tails. Work now, bitch later," Corporal George chided, as he looked across what was probably once a collection of low, compared with the palace, buildings. The collection of rubble and burning vehicles did not look inviting. End of chapter. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.